Good morning. It's my pleasure to see everyone who joins us in Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum. My name is Olga Atamanova. It's been 10 years of the war, and today's day 624 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor. And I want to traditionally thank the representatives of all the mass media who tell the world the truth about our heroic resistance. Today we have invited you for a very important event for our country. We will be discussing the results of the European Commission report on Ukraine's progress within the enlargement package. We will be talking about what's on. So I want to introduce our speakers today. It's Olga Stefanishina, Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine for European and Euro-Atlantic integration, and Katerina Maternova, EU Ambassador to Ukraine. Good morning, Ms. Olga, Ms. Katerina. I would like to discuss the decision of European Commission, which recommended the members of the European Union to open negotiations on accession of Ukraine to European Union. So let's discuss this decision. What is it going to mean for Ukraine? The floor is yours, please. Good morning. Thank you. It's my pleasure to see such an attention to this matter. And yesterday we allowed ourselves to rejoice a little bit about the good news. The decision was approved for the European Commission to recommend to start negotiations with Ukraine. The decision was confirmed that Ukraine complies with the Copenhagen criteria in view of the progress of all 7 recommendations. Ms. Katerina may tell you in more detail about the procedures, the aspects, how to properly read the report, but without exaggeration, it's a historic decision and probably the most important political decision on current stage. In addition to the decisions related to the membership of Ukraine in European Union, we were realizing that this document would be presented yesterday, and yesterday after Ms. Katerina handed it over to the President, the order was signed that outlines the further steps. And I would like to draw your attention to the fact that this report is not only about 7 criteria, not only about the political aspects, not only it contains recommendations on the enlargement, but it also contains 150 pages of assessment of us as a country from the point of view of functioning of economy, institutions for the accession to European Union. And based on this document, the negotiations framework will be created. And now we may already see the obligations with regard to our membership. And we are about to prepare a national program of preparation for accession to European Union. It was ordered by the President already, and it will be updated on an annual basis with a view of the progress and dynamics of the negotiations. In our understanding, we withdraw from the story with 7 recommendations. We move on into the direction of preparation to the negotiations. We consider 4 additional criteria outlined by the European Commission as such, regarding which Ukraine has taken obligations already. So there was a recommendation to take those criteria into account by European Commission. And we have already agreed with the European Commission. Well, there are remarks, but there are no doubts that the decision will be approved in December, and we will start the preparation immediately after the 15th of December. And availing myself of opportunity, I would like to thank the expert community, Ukrainian civil society, and our deputies for your integration for this wonderful report on all items, starting with ecology and ending with the rule of law. I was trying to assure Brussels of the fact that Ukrainians are going to read the report, getting familiarized with that, but what's most important is that we have 150 pages of progress, and that's a huge deed of every single Ukrainian who contributed to it, of every single warrior who availed us of this opportunity. Thank you very much, Ms. Katerina. The floor is yours. Let's talk in more detail about the technical part of the report. Thank you very much, dear Ukrainian friends.
And through the this thing. But with the journalists, one needs to get every little nuance. So I, to be on the safe side, will both speak in English and listen through the this little thing here. I would like to very much echo, Madam Deputy Prime Minister, dear Olga, what you said, that yesterday was time to celebrate. I personally did celebrate. It was an incredible milestone, very similar milestone in importance as getting the candidate status a year ago. What was hoped for was achieved, that at the first official evaluation of the progress, the Commission would recommend opening accession negotiations, and that happened. I know there was quite a lot of excitement in the media the day before, and people were checking, you know, which numbers of steps out of what was deemed fulfilled, not fulfilled, etc. Those are all important aspects of the overall 150 pages. But what is the important political message is in the shorter document, the one that talks about all the 10 countries of the enlargement process, the 6 Western Balkans, Turkey, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. And there the language is very clear. Ukraine has made sufficient progress on the Copenhagen criteria to allow the Commission to recommend to the Council, which is the member states, to open negotiations with Ukraine, period. And this same mirror language is actually applied also to Moldova. So the 2 countries, Ukraine and Moldova, are recommended to open negotiations. Now, that was the celebratory part. What happens today is that the hard work starts, because the report has actually commentary on across the board on a number of areas, and this is something that will be coming regularly from the European Commission on a yearly basis, regardless whether the negotiations start or not. Already by getting a European perspective, let alone the candidate status, you became part of the enlargement family that gets these yearly reports. And there is going to be some praise, some commentary, some criticism, some urging what to do. This is going to be an ongoing process for a very long time. So get used to the prose and the style that we bureaucrats use, and the level of scrutiny that goes into the very great number of areas. And I would like to echo a second point that Madam Stefanishina said, that this was really a huge collective effort. There is the role for you, the independent media, in pushing the authorities in this or that direction. There is the huge role of the civil society, of the expert groups, of the think tanks, of the action tanks, again, both in pushing as well as facilitating expertise. And there is the whole of government effort. And Olga, I must say that your leadership on this file has really been exemplary, and the involvement with your group of deputy ministers for your Atlantic integration played a huge role. And I was yesterday also in the Rada. The Rada is actually an incredible lawmaking machine. I mean, they don't know what's going to hit them once the negotiations open. because the amount of so-called acquis communautaire, the amount of the body of laws and norms that the EU is bound together with is huge. But already now they have really stepped up and helped pass really incredibly important legislation, and the leadership of the Prime Minister and the leadership of the President could not be underestimated. I mean, it was very, very clear that from very top, but also from the bottom, there was this mobilization that is very visible and very appreciated. And for me, it's really personal delight to have been the one that could have handed over this inelegantly bound, because we couldn't get it bound because it came hot off the press yesterday. So we just put the report together, and it was a pleasure to be able to share it with you. So happy to answer any questions.
Дякую вам, пані Ольго, пані Катерина. Безумовно, мабуть, для всіх українців це така маленька перемога наша, але всі ми
Ms. Olga, Ms. Katerina, this is a small victory for all of the Ukrainians. We understand we have to move on. This is an important way that we will have to work. We know that the changes have, the rules have changed for Ukraine. That will be a little bit shorter way. So can we please talk in more detail how this way was shortened for Ukraine?
Look, enlargement process is not physics. Enlargement process is not physics. So there are no mathematical formulas that guide it. For enlargement, you need essentially two main elements. One is the political will on both sides and the technical capacity on both sides again. And when you have some of these elements missing, it can get very long. And we are now ending the first 10-year period, first decade in history of the European Union that did not see any enlargement of the EU between 2013 and 2023. Clearly, there was both a lack of reforms, but ultimately it was mainly a lack of political will. The EU did not want to enlarge. And with the terrible war and the terrible price that Ukrainians are paying, it actually created the momentum and the realization. So now we are in a new reality with a new momentum for enlargement. So it is expedited by that definition. So as much as Ukraine will be able to be doing the technical work quickly, it will be pushing also the political process. So I was asked yesterday in the Rada, you know, what is the usual way of, I don't remember what, and I said, well, there is nothing usual when it comes to Ukraine and enlargement. You are breaking any and all records, right? You submitted the questionnaire in 2 weeks. That never happened in history. So nobody can give a timeline, but a lot will depend on you. But also, and this is something that we need to remember, it's not only about your will and capacity to reform while fighting a war, as impressive as it is. It's also about the ability of the European Union to reform itself. Because to expand further, it will need to adjust the decision-making processes, some policies, etc. And that's not going to be uncontroversial. That's going to be difficult. So these two things will have to go hand in hand.
Наступний крок ми всі чекаємо, звісно, на саміт Європейського Союзу.
Well, we all expect for the summit of European Union that is about to happen on the 14th of December. All the decisions should be approved there. I cannot help but asking about the challenges that expect for us. Probably all of the Ukrainians understand the so-called Hungarian factor. Can you please comment on that? What are your expectations? Thank you.
We certainly would hope that my celebration of yesterday will be doubled after the European summit, and I very much hope that the opening of negotiations will be confirmed or decided on by the member states. I just would not underestimate, please, the need to engage with all, discuss, and not take this decision for granted.
Дякую вам, шановні колеги. Хочу надати вам можливість поставити питання.
Thank you, dear colleagues. I would like to give the floor to you so we can ask the questions. Ivan Kosakin, Ukraine Forum. Ms. Vice Prime Minister, I would like to ask the question from you. We were recommended to start the negotiations with such an asterisk, anti-corruption agencies, and all the relevant reforms. Are we going to be able to make it by the beginning of the negotiations?
Merit-based, but as in case of North Macedonia, it pretty often ends up being political. Would you recommend the Ukraine to get ready for it to end up being political? Thank you.
Дякую. Окрім
Thank you very much. Apart from the good news that we were hearing yesterday, and we really could celebrate it yesterday, we still have to realize that it's the stage of growth for our country on a professional level, on a content level. So it's a stage of growing up, and now we will have to sort out the nuances, as Ms. Katerina counted yesterday as she handed over the document to me and Prime Minister. The member states will have about 100 opportunities to block the decision on Ukrainian membership during any period. This is why we will have to sort out the nuances. The 4 criteria identified by the European Commission, they are of technical nature. They are not of a fundamental nature, and those 4 criteria are recommendations that European Council may or may not listen to, and those 4 criteria have no connection to political decision to be approved in December. I mean that after the approval of political decision, if it will happen, it's expected for the European Commission to start working as soon as there is a progress on those 4 criteria. Those are important nuances. However, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the President of the European Commission visited Ukraine a couple of days before the publication of a report, and all those criteria were discussed both in terms of the structure of lobbying legislation and anti-corruption agencies and national minorities. The President has understanding and provided his political obligation that those tasks will be fulfilled, and in December we will be witnessing progress in those criteria. And Ms. Katerina?
If I may just briefly comment on the asterisks you mentioned, there is no asterisk behind the recommendation to open negotiations. There is no asterisk. There is a straight, I'm looking at it right now, there is a sentence that ends with a full stop, there is no asterisk. If you read further, there are the 4 criteria that need to be evaluated before the next step takes place. There's no asterisk and no qualification on the recommendation to open negotiations. It's a straight recommendation. 1 sentence ends with a full stop. That's important to understand. I realize that the bureaucratic language may be complicated and it's in the middle of a paragraph, but it's a straight recommendation with no qualifications. That just to have no misunderstanding on that. Now, on your question between merit-based and political, I mean, the enlargement process is innately political. The merit-based is then the fulfillment of the criteria, the reforms that need to take place, etc. But just by the very nature that it's subject to unanimity of all member states makes it political. Ukrainian enlargement is political, it's geopolitical even. But then the merit-based aspect comes in the technical fulfillment, because this is the trick, that it's very demanding technocratically, but it's happening in a political framework. And the political framework currently, this was the window of opportunity that Olga would have heard me talk about before, when you were when you were an associated country with the DCFTA, etc. And I was telling everyone that I worked with, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Ukraine, there will be a window of opportunity. You need to be prepared for it, because it may not be big. I, in my worst dreams, nightmares, did not think that the window is going to open because of the terrible, terrible war and the cost that you are paying. But it created a window, and you grabbed it. It was 3 days or 4 days after the terrible Thursday morning in February of last year that you submitted an application. That's taking advantage of a window of opportunity. So that's a political thing. And then there is going to be also the technocratic process that one needs to have capacity for and invest in.
Дякую вам. Прошу.
Please, thank you, please. Good morning, Sergei Stukhanov, Ukrainian Radio. I would like to ask Ms. Vice Prime Minister, Ms. Olga, I would like to get back to those 4 criteria for items, because among them, there are important, sensitive issues. We're talking about recommendations for to the law on state language and education. I know that there are different amendments discussed in the government, but it's a sensitive issue. So, in your opinion, what is unacceptable and what are the concessions Ukraine could accept? Thank you very much. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that during the visit of the President of the European Commission, a lion's share of our discussion was dedicated to the way that Ukrainians are going to perceive those decisions announced by the European Commission. So that lecturing was going on through Monday and Tuesday, and both me and President, we were saying, look, everybody is going to focus on 4 criteria, and Ms. Katerina can confirm it. But we couldn't see it from Brussels. And our colleagues from European Commission and President personally thinks that the most important is the decision to open negotiations. So again, this decision will be politically confirmed because it's already confirmed by the executive body of European Union, the European Commission. Talking about the 4 criteria, well, I don't want Hungary to become a top topic in the enlargement process, because I think we will be able to overcome this challenge as well. It will be a challenge for us for the next month. And at the same time, we didn't just sit around. In September, the government sent a delegation to Budapest with the representatives of the Parliament, State Service on Education, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and upon the results of those negotiations, Hungary was provided a roadmap that contained technical organization measures regarding the education process, the textbooks, organization of the education process, additional amendments on the legislation, and it should become a basis for negotiations. And I can confirm today that we strictly segregate the issues of the rights of Hungarian minority in Ukraine, which are satisfied just like all other minorities that were, for example, affected way less than the rights of Greeks in Azov region who were left without their homes. Mariupol is occupied, and there are minorities in Ukraine who face way more challenges, and segregating these issues of the Hungarian government that brings it up. You know, those are two big differences, as they say in Odessa. There was unprecedented attention to the Transcarpathian region, the district of Berehovo. President visited that place along with a number of government delegations, and they actively work with that issue. The schools are funded, the textbooks are in place, and politically we're confident this challenge will be overcome. We don't talk about concessions here, but we have to understand that our dialogue is brought to a different level. As it was said multiple times, all of the countries that were joined in European Union, since we have common history, we live in the same continent, a lot of things are mixed. All of those countries, they had questions regarding the minorities. Some of them had to change their names on their way to NATO, for example. For some of them it was taking decades or more than decades to become a part of European Union, or decades in negotiations. So again, there will be changes in regard of the education, language, and other aspects, but they will have definitely nothing to do with opportunity not to speak Ukrainian language. Well, we know that those criteria are being very vividly discussed in Ukrainian society. I agree with this. But talking about the requirements to Hungary and this law on national minorities, you've mentioned that the negotiations are underway, but these new requirements, some people say those criteria are a little bit vague and can be construed in a different way by different parties. Like, for example, Hungary itself. Can you confirm it? Yeah, I absolutely confirm it. This is the great concept of this wording. And we have to pay attention to the fact that we talk about fulfillment of certain aspects. The opinion of Venetian Commission, which means that sufficient will be the progress that Ukraine will agree on with the stakeholders, internal stakeholders, member states, and our colleagues from Brussels. So yes, there is certain leverage, but there is a field for speculation too. Any state that consciously approves the decision to block accession of Ukraine, they may find reasons for that. So it's not about the problems, but about conscious political decision. Today, Hungary has made that statement. We understand that this statement exists, but at the same time, we understand that there is a dialogue with Budapest. There is a visit of the president of Hungary to Ukraine. We have this challenge. We know how to fight in the front lines, and we know how to fight in the Euro integration front line.
Monica, I'm a journalist from Politico Europe, and I have a question maybe for both. So you said about the fact that war in Ukraine opened the momentum for European Union enlargement, and Ukraine is doing so much reforming during war. I was wondering about your thoughts, whether it's fair that other countries, like for example Georgia, that is backtracking on the path to European Union standards and is helping Russia to violate sanctions, getting on this momentum and getting some prospects in the EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have situations with very clear yearning and I would say very similar. I'm not saying that Georgia is paying the kind of price, Georgian population paying the kind, I'm not trying to make a similarity with Ukraine in that sense, but there is an all population Georgia yearning for joining the European Union, long-standing one, very present. There is not a single person you would meet in Tbilisi or outside that would not say we want to, that I have met, whether it was opposition or the government or civil society or journalists or people in the taxi that I talked to. So, and if you read the document that I was quoting from, and I strongly encourage you guys to read not only the Ukraine part, but read across all the 10 countries. It's very instructive reading to see how the wording changes, etc. There is recognition of this desire of the population, and Georgia has made many steps and has gone quite a long way to align with the acquis in the previous years. Yes, there are issues that of fundamental political nature that we would like them to make changes on, and that is why they are given candidate status on the understanding that, here is the asterisk, right? In the case of Georgia, there is a comma on the understanding that, and there is a fairly long list of expectations and requirements. So I think the calibration is correct, because I think it's not only in the interest of Georgia, it's in the interest of the European Union to have Georgia in the European family as well.
Ще питання, друзі? З того боку.
Any more questions, dear friends? I will have two questions. Ms. Olga, first question to you regarding the future. What's on for us after the political decision? Okay, negotiations with the 24 member states and then 35 chapters, and how many more laws do we have to adopt? And do you still consider that period that was mentioned by the head of the government, Denis Shmyhal, that the accession would take 2 years, or whether we should be more realistic that it will take way longer? And another question is to you, Ms. Ambassador. Do you consider engagement of Ukrainian people's deputies in the processes within the European Union, maybe as observers, starting, say, from the year 2025? So can Ukraine be involved in the work of the bloc as observers? Thank you. Thank you for your question. Well, and probably I will answer some more questions that were asked today. So the process of enlargement, its speed and dynamics, well, it will be efficient, it will be fast, due to two reasons. First, because it's an existential decision. Europe has already chosen to be enlarged, to have 8 more countries join the European Union, and in combination with Ukrainian victory in the front line, it will be yet another item added to the formula of peace of President Zelensky, the return to the peaceful Europe and approval of peace in Europe. And secondly, without Ukraine, all this process of reinforcement of peace in in Europe is impossible. This is why Ukraine moves fast, Ukraine dictates the rules, Ukraine is mobilized and prepares the decisions ahead. So apart from fulfillment of European criteria, we were preparing to this, regardless of the fact whether the decision would be or would not be approved. We've made self-screening. That's the procedure that takes usually 3 years. 2 is a very fast of a period. Sometimes it takes more than 4 years. So we've already done the self-screening, and now we have the decision of European Commission that we can start fulfilling right now. And regardless of further political things related to the negotiations, we start preparing, we start the screening, we start to prepare the negotiations framework. So Ukraine defines the dynamics here. And until Ukraine actively moves, proactively fulfilling its tasks, thinking 10 steps ahead, until that moment we can stay calm. But you know, you mentioned 2 years. I was talking about 2 years always. But in my understanding, it was 2 years after the beginning of negotiations. Now 1 year has passed already, and in my horizon of understanding, that year never counted. So 2 years after the beginning of negotiations, well, in my opinion, it's real for Ukraine to fulfill our homework within 2 weeks in the way my team planned it, in the way President and the Parliament support this process. I think it's absolutely possible. Ms. Katerina?
It's important to have a high ambition and strive for it, and congratulations on that. And we will really do our best on our side to also overcome the sometimes glacial processes. It was not easy to respond so quickly and do the avis we did in 2 months or something that would have taken a lot longer previously. So it's a mutual adaptation and a mutual learning. And that applies also to the question that I was given about observer status for Ukrainian government bodies, Rada, etc. This is debated. Formats like this are debated. This is where the adjustments and looking at increasing the big numbers, because 1 seat for Ukraine and 1 seat for Moldova are 2 seats, right? Even if the countries are much, much different. So one has to calibrate how to do it, but there is this idea of joining some of the bodies earlier is very much something in consideration, not yet decided. But Ukraine, for example, already participates in many, if not most, European Union programs. You already are part of a number of formats and bodies. For example, recently you joined the Civil Protection Mechanism, which is the collective of member states plus a few others, now including Ukraine as well, that has been delivering all the, not only humanitarian, but all the support and energy and the big transformers, etc., the logistics channel, etc. So you are now full member of it. So, and there is, I don't remember others, but there is a number of parts of the EU machinery that you're already part of, and there is consideration of others. But I would like to make one maybe a little philosophical comment that ties with some of the previous questions. You guys are talking about requirements and concessions and criteria. I have news for you. Get used to it. The enlargement process is a grueling one. I went through it. I'm from Slovakia. It's not always pleasant. You are going to be asked things that sometimes will not make sense. Sometimes you will think like, who are you to require that? And we all went through it because the price was worth it. And it's a fascinating, somebody who writes well and writes books or op-eds, etc., may take a license and write this, but it's a fascinating situation that you're fighting for your national sovereignty, spilling blood on the front line, and at the same time you're fighting to get into a bloc where you will have to give up a lot of your sovereignty. It's different kind of sovereignty, but joining the European Union is giving up sovereignty in specific areas on specific issues. And that's something to wrap our minds around, that there is this dichotomy. I mean, it makes sense when you look at that you are fighting against Russian aggression and you're trying to join a peaceful, democratic, prosperous bloc. but there is a level of decision making that you will be transferring onto others in specific areas, etc. But you also will be joining a bloc where a lot of things have to happen by consensus, which is not always, sometimes ugly, it's not always pretty, sometimes you have setbacks, but the direction of travel is clear.
Я дуже дякую за цей ваш коментар. Прошу.
Thank you very much for this comment.
Follow up to both of our speakers. Katarina, you just said that we have to implement many things that are unpleasant sometimes if they are in the EU acquis. Now we see that in these 4 recommendations, at least some of them has nothing to do with the acquis, and the latest, or one of them, which is about lobbying law, has appeared out of blue. It was absent in 7 steps. It has nothing to do with entire oligarchization as declared. It was absent in oral update, and we see that the EU is trying to impose something completely new, which has nothing to do with EU law. And we are a bit afraid that it goes by Western Balkans scenario. Is there a chance, how do you see, is there a chance to amend at least this recommendation, not to make it as obligatory, because we're afraid that we would be forced by the EU to make something which has nothing to do with European integration. And Olga, if you can comment on this specific thing, I would very much appreciate it. And regarding time frame, when do you expect to have intergovernmental conference that would be really launch a negotiation which will launch this 2-year period? Because we have to understand. Yeah, thank you.
We have another delay, so not when the accession talks will. Я почну.
Well, let me start with the lobbying legislation. There is such a thing in Brussels to leave a type of anchor, a room for maneuver, so to say. So basically this law is this room for maneuver. Like, what if we will need to say something else to Ukraine, or we wouldn't be able just to say that Ukraine has overcome the oligarchs' influence in the country, but we have left no more positions that can be set as an anchor for Ukraine, because we've got the opinion of Venetian Commission that recognizes the oligarchic system as a system inherent in the countries of post-Soviet camp and Eastern European country as inevitable aspect of transition to the normal functioning, civilized functioning. And Georgia and Moldova got the same recommendations, so that this law, we've postponed the personality part of its implementation. We've approved the legislation that reinforces the anti-monopoly committee. We've approved the legislation on transparency of funding of political parties. We've approved legislation on media that is dedicated to a large section of which is dedicated to the transparency of the structure of ownership. We've approved the legislation on politically exposed persons. So again, that was the last anchor left, and there was a request, official request from European Commission not to hurry up with this law, because some of the controversial norms of this law, they influence the civil society. So this is why the European Commission asked us not to hurry up with this legislation, so that it's approved normally, but in the end of the day, we have it as an anchor after those 4 recommendations, And in the block of de-oligarchization, yes, we will fulfill it. It will be difficult to find a balance, but because the parliament has a great appetite to approve this law. There's a huge desire to adopt this legislation, and National Agency for Prevention of Corruption also want to have this legislation adopted, but there is a huge miscommunication with the civil society, and there is a unique feature of Ukraine, this civil society that was formed after the revolution of dignity. It's a unique story in the country when the civil society is a full-fledged authority in Ukraine. They influence all the processes, and it should be taken into account while adopting this new legislation so that our civil society goes level up. But we at the same time have to make sure that this legislation is not a tool of pressure. So we have the time pressing, but we don't have to destroy the civil society by adopting this law. So the anchor is taken, and okay, we're going to work with it. Ms. Katerina, we're curious about your opinion in this regard. Thank you.
Only urge you not to destroy the role of civil society, as you say, in the process on account on any speed on this. I have discussed this requirement also with my G7 colleagues, and we are all committed to help with setting up a working group and really rapidly have a dialogue on how to calibrate the rules of it in a way that will work for all stakeholders. But it's a broader point, Sergei, that there are issues that are directly addressed in the acquis, in the EU rules and norms. No. I'm saying there are issues, chemical labeling, environmental standards, etc., right? The thousands and tens of thousands of pages of EU acquis. And then there are things that are not, for a very simple reason. The European Union was a club of 6 developed democratic economies early on. And then it kept adding. And as successive enlargements happened, and when countries like mine got in, there was a realization that actually the institutions don't work, the basis, the fundamentals of societies don't work. So we now have them under fundamentals without having prescriptive rules. For example, there is no one type of judiciary. There are 27 types of judiciary. Some countries are decentralized, some countries are centralized, some countries have 2 bodies in the parliament, some have 1. So there are no prescriptive rules. There is no acquis on the fundamentals, as I say. And that doesn't mean that we are not going to require them because they are important for the democratic norms and standards which is in the treaty. In other words, you have the treaty rules. We are democracies, we protect minorities, we protect human rights, we have a political pluralistic culture, etc. And those then don't have prescriptive rules. So therefore you see this level of interpretation or maneuver to read into it, which is then done on the basis of knowing the country, what are the sensitive areas where you need to. For example, we have pushed and financed also with a very sizable amount decentralization. There is no acquis on decentralization, but for the democratic development of this country, I think this was one of the most successful reforms so far. And so that all is part of the block of fundamentals, which is the main building block of the accession process. The other ones are technical, and this is the important one, and therefore I am actually very optimistic once the negotiations start that Ukraine can move fast, because you have done over the last number of years and very intensely in the last year a lot on these fundamentals, the one that is not as well prescribed in the directives and regulations, And that's much harder to find consensus on and develop.
Дякую вам. Давайте ще два питання маємо закінчити.
Well, let's take two more questions and let us wrap up further on.
There was a question on the timing. So the sequence is the follows. Opening of negotiations is one step. Next step is getting a negotiating mandate, the Commission getting a negotiating mandate. For that step, we have the four criteria that we just discussed. And after that is intergovernmental conference that kicks off the negotiations, right? But I mean, some of these things can be back to back. I mean, it depends on the preparedness, the political momentum, etc. But that's the technical sequence of things.
Андрій Городиський, РФА українською. Yesterday I discussed Commission's enlargement report considering Western Balkans with local think tanks, and there is one issue that was firstly voiced by Serbian analytics, but as I understand it, it's like common for whole region, is some kind of fatigue for the region because they're almost 2 decades on their way to the EU, and some part of their public like tired and disappointed. Actually, all of us don't believe this is the case for Ukraine, but still, what can the EU do to avoid this fatigue in Ukraine? Of course, understanding that the first role here, the most important role here is under Ukrainian authorities, but still what can the EU do to avoid this fatigue in Ukraine? And maybe для пані віце-прем'єр-міністерки так само, що ми очікуємо від Євросоюзу.
And the question to Ms. Prime Minister is, what do we expect from the European Union so that we can stay mobilized and not get tired of this way? Well, the last thing I can say about our Euro integration path is that we are not organized, not motivated, so it's not about us. And really, it's sad to hear a lot of things because we've really been through a lot of things, and we know what it is like when the war begins. We know what it is like when all the world stands by your side, and we know what it is like to have the world fatigued with the war. We know what are the populists who try to undermine the existence of the democratic world itself. We know how to rejoice with our European choice, and we know how this fatigue spreads, and it's sad because the Ukrainian people within the 30 plus years of independence was through a lot of things, and we have to always understand that it's Ukraine who was giving hope to Europe. Ukrainians who walked out on the European square or to the Independence Square on the 21st of November, when one person in this country decided they know best where Ukraine should move to. And so we've reestablished the European values back in 2013 when we were standing in Maidan. And now we reinforce this faith into the European Union, and we reinforced the faith of Balkan countries to become the members of European Union. I was given this example multiple times during one of my visits to one of the key capitals of the European Union before the war, and I was hearing there were no remarks regarding Ukraine. There is absence of support by the citizens of the European Union of the lack of their support of enlargement process, and the things have changed thanks to Ukraine. The way that Ukraine fights, the way Ukraine supports this positive nature of enlargement, we reinforce this hope in the Western Balkans. This decision will be adopted. Today there is confidence that the Western Balkans are becoming a part of EU, and it's a done deal. There is no discussion about that. I think that there was no such confidence within all this period as they were moving. So please don't think.
I would very much agree that the best thing that could happen to the Western Balkans was this new momentum that Ukraine brought into the enlargement process, because now the new momentum is for both, right? It's both for the Western Balkans and this part of the East, if we call part of the what we used to call Eastern Partnership. On your other question, remind me very quickly. What can the EU do? I think that the best is for Ukraine not to allow us to not give us any reason to lower the momentum. I think the commitment to Ukraine is almost surprisingly solid, even in opinion polls. I think Olga just talked about that. I mean, there is support for enlargement well over 50%. I mean, this is unprecedented, let alone support for humanitarian and financial, etc., and for refugees. So the support, commitment, solidarity with Ukraine is strong. And I think that there is, and to quote Madame von der Leyen on Monday, she was talking to us, the ambassadors meeting that we had in Brussels, and she was saying we are living now in a world where we increasingly realize in Europe that size and weight matter. And if you look at it this way, in today's and I apologize, I have a little nasmork. When you think of it in these geopolitical terms, then Ukraine is a huge addition to the EU, with all the aspects of it, not only economic, but the strength of the civil society, one of your greatest assets, and the mobilization and the resilience and all of that. So I think that you have the capacity not to let us get into a fatigue.
Дякую вам. На жаль, час спливає дуже швидко. Давайте
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're running out of time quite quickly. Zhana Pospichuk, BBC.
Sir, the question is, my question is on the reforms that the European Union has to carry out itself on the way to the first expansion. The question on the reforms. You mentioned that the European Union itself has to carry out reforms to make possible the first expansion. The question is, can you explain in detail what exactly is required from the European Union, especially if the amendments to the treaties on the European Union still have to be made? I mean, if it includes the requirement to make any amendments of the treaties or no? These reforms which are needed for the expansion. And one more question, the protection of the Russian language in Ukraine, whether it's still the issue on the table when it comes to the changes to the education and state language legislation in Ukraine required to make possible Ukraine's accession, whether Hungary and Slovakia can use this sensitive issue to complicate Ukraine's way to the accession talks and then the talks themselves. Thank you.
So who can answer this question?
Можливо, я поки що буду говорити.
Well, let me start answering about the Russian language. So I think that in the Ukrainian context, we don't have to say a lot. Everything has already been said. But I would like to recall the first discussion on this issue when the opinion of the Venetian committee was being prepared. I was talking to Mati Masigas, he's the citizen of Estonia, the previous ambassador before Ms. Katerina, and he told me a very simple thing, so we understand that we're not unique in this situation. So he said that Russian Federation was using the same strategy in Estonia for many years about Russian minorities, Russian-speaking population, Russian language, but there is a life hack in this story. In Ukraine, there is no Russian minority. It just does not exist. There is no legally organized community that identify themselves as Russian minority. There are Russian-speaking citizens of Ukraine. I'm from Odessa myself, and and sometimes I speak English when I want, and sometimes I do not. I don't need Venetian Commission or Moscow's for that reason. So this is not even an issue in Ukraine, and I'm happy that Venetian Commission realizes the sensitivity of this issue. Ms. Katerina, please.
Thank you. The issues that need to be addressed inside the EU for enlargement to take place, and again, it's not about Ukraine. It's about the fact that it would be a number of countries, so the numbers would get higher. Is a question of the institutional makeup of the different bodies. Right now, we have one country, one judge on the European Court of Justice. Is there a sustainable number if you expand by 8 or 10, right? The same thing about number of commissioners, number of members of the Court of Auditors, and things like that. Big issue is the issue of unanimity in decision making on foreign policy, for example, on enlargement, and several others. And there are also issues of budget, issues of different policies, and this is hotly debated. What can be done without treaty change, and where you would have to get into a treaty change. So there are no answers right now. This is precisely the discussion that's taking place, and it's very difficult. You know, there were some ideas before this momentum on enlargement. There were some ideas, we first need to reform and only then we are able to take new members in. I think that has been overcome, the realization that you have to do these things in parallel. So in parallel, as the aspirant members will be reforming, we will have to work on the institutional changes, but there is now more pressure. And European Union is famous for reforming in big leaps when there is a crisis or when there is a pressure. And there is now pressure on coming up with these changes. But there are no answers yet. There are lots of various views, but nothing has been fixed as an exact roadmap.
Я хочу подякувати вам за цю безумовно змістовну.
I want to thank you very much for this profound conversation. I hope our journalists got their answers to their questions. We would like to thank our international partners for all of the decisions that were taken. We want to thank the team who worked to make these decisions to be taken, and we want to thank our armed forces, thanks to whom we have this opportunity to move forward and to have events like this. Thank you very much. Let's continue working for our victory. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes.